Hello and welcome back to PolyToots. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at how to do rain forming down the surface of a surface. Oh, this is off to a great start, isn't it? So yeah, not the floor. That's only here because I want to put in a cheap plug to this tutorial that I've already done. So the link will be here or in the description. But what we're actually going to be doing today is these objects you see here. So the ball and the cube, and so how this rain kind of just trickles down it. And this tutorial is going to be slightly different than my previous ones. Rather than like a step-by-step like guide on how to do it, we'll initially cover kind of how to set things up, and then I will run through what I've done. And the reason for that is it can take quite a while to kind of get the particle systems the way that you want, and trying to do a tutorial on that, it would just mean like I'd have to speed through a lot of stuff and explain my result anyway. So yeah, that's what it is for now. So let's take a look, a quick look. We will get to the tutorial soon, I promise. We'll take a quick look at the material that we'll be making. We're doing this in the Amplify Shader Editor, but for anyone using Shader Graph, no need to kind of close the window immediately. Like, this whole node setup is crazy simple. You will be able to follow along. I just figured it's been a while since I've done an Amplify video, so you know. And I like the guys over at Amplify, so it's about time that I went back to it. So yeah, pretty standard setup. There's an albedo for your albedo. There's a normal map with just some strength that I don't use, just because the example I think works better on like a a smooth surface. I have a slider for the actual smoothness. Now this is the base, not the actual rain. The rain is always wet. You could, if you want, replace this with your own texture, but either way, you're probably going to want some controls in there, because as something starts to get rained on, then it would become more and more wet. And when something's really kind of wet, the normal maps of the rain, they work really nicely with the environment. But yeah, so stuff to do. There is also tiling amount for the rain, and you may have noticed maybe during the introduction, there is actually a seam here. Sometimes it's kind of hard to notice, which is good. That's why I've kind of included the tiling amount. But it is something you kind of have to be careful of, because we're basically making this with a particle system, so it's really hard to make that tile. So yeah, if you can, great. If you can't, keep kind of tweaking some things, because you might be able to get away with it. But if I were to just put this up to 4 or something like that, maybe just bring it back down to 2. Yeah, you should be able to see, I think maybe here. I might be getting real lucky with these, but in theory that should be where the seam is, but as it's so hard to tell, it's it's pretty cool. And then so lastly, well, second to lastly, I forgot to mention, you can change the tint of your stuff, because when things get wetter, normally in games at least, we just make them a bit darker. It seems to kind of sell the illusion. So yeah, lastly then we have a render texture, and that's basically just a camera that exists out in the scene that's looking at this whole particle system that's happening. So yeah, so let's actually just go and stop playing that. I will hop into a new scene, and we'll start kind of doing the basics of what I've done. Okay, so here we are in a new scene, and for now I'll just get down a cube. I will also get in another camera, and let's just kind of put that, well, wherever. Let's face it off over there or something, and I will get a particle system. So this is just, well, for now, let me just do that, and then 0, 0, 0, just so now the particle system exists in the same place as the camera, but now I can take it, oh, oops, now I can take it out and just kind of plonk it around somewhere. That'll do. And for the camera itself, the one that we're using to look at the particle system, change skybox clear factor here to solid color, and we'll just make the background completely black. So this will basically be a representation of a black and white texture. So that's kind of it as far as that goes. You will need a render texture. So if you go to the create menu, you can just go to render texture here, and we'll just call this one example render text, and I hit caps lock at some point, but that's fine, I'm only human. So then on the camera that is looking at these particles, it has a target texture here, and we will put our render texture in there. And now, we can't actually look through the camera anymore in the game view because it's basically rendering what it sees to a texture, which will exist in the example text. So right now, it has that on screen, so we're looking at this, and if I were to, if I were to hit play, then yeah, to be fair, you might not see it update immediately, but if I were to keep going back and forth here, if I do it really, really quick, but either way, it is generating that texture, so that's all good. And let's come back to our cube here. So just real quickly, let's get a Amplify Shader. We use a surface shader. Here we go, Amplify Surface. Yep. And I'm not going to keep this, so I might as well just leave that blank, but obviously you can just add in whatever name and organizing stuff that you want. If you didn't already know, if you do, let's say anything and then / something, and I'll just commit that, then if you create a material, your new shader will exist in the anything window, which is spelled incorrectly, and your shader will be called something. So, hope that clears up that. But all we have to do here, there's nothing special at all. We're just going to use a texture sample, and we don't even need the RGBA. We just use the red channel, and I'll just throw that into albedo. You can call it whatever you want. Just say render text. Doesn't actually matter. And that will do for that, unless I'm forgetting something. Hopefully not, though. So we did make a new material here, so might as well actually just go to anything spelled incorrectly and then something. So this is now using our new shader, and we'll put that material on our cube. And so now if we grab our new render texture and use that as a texture, let's close this, whenever the particle plays, so that's over there and the camera's looking at it, the result is projected here as a texture. Pretty cool, pretty simple. Yeah, render textures are very cool, very versatile. You can do some pretty cool things with them. So let's go back to my scene, and I'll just kind of run through how all of that was set up. Okay, so here we are, and here are my particle systems. Yeah, seems to be working. And if I were to just hit F now, so these are just way off in the scene somewhere. The main drawback to using this kind of thing is that it does mean somewhere in your scene you will have to have these particles always rendering and a camera looking at them, because if you were to just try and drop this, like if I were to go into a new scene and try to use the same material without this particle system, it's not going to work because it won't have that render texture to reference from. So yeah, that's it's the main drawback, but you can get some pretty nice results with it. So let's, before we hop into the shader side of things, I will just quickly let's just stop all of this. I'm just going to run through, not with the trail, I'll start with the static. I'll run through my general sort of thought process as I was making this, and the first thing that kind of popped to mind is the shape. You're going to be rendering usually like a square texture anyway. You don't have to. You absolutely do not have to. So I'm not saying that you have to, but for me, and I was trying to do like the tiling stuff. So basically what I'm trying to say is that I made it a square, so that's why it's a square. Hopefully that helps. So yeah, I went with the box and I just changed the Y value to a 0. So everything just spawns, on that sort of Y plane. And I am using a render texture here, but we'll come to that in a minute. But there's nothing really fancy happening here. It's just a bunch of particles in a box that's just spawning over 6 seconds. And there's 80 of them, which is, it's a fair amount. We're sort of generating about 480 now, but convincing rain requires quite a lot. But, feel free to tweak any of these. Start size, roughly kind of changing things up a bit, and the start rotation. By default, you only have a constant. So if you want to use a range, then you just hit this little arrow here, and then it'll be a random between 2 constants. Start color, I've reduced the alpha just a touch, just because I thought it was coming through on my object a little too strong. You might have a different result if you're using, a different texture with different levels of white, basically. What else is there? Simulation speed. I did put that up to 2. 1 also still kind of works. It's still pretty rapid, but I just went up to 2. It's also for this style of kind of particle system, just increasing the simulation speed is a great way to almost like fake the effect that there's more particles spawning without actually having to spawn more particles. But of course the trade-off is that they come and go a lot quicker. So yeah, we covered the emission. That was just, a fairly large number. The shape, just a box. Color over lifetime, pretty simple. Just a gradient so that I'm alphaing like the whole thing out. Pretty standard stuff. And then yeah, I am using a texture sheet animator, and the only kind of weird thing that I'm doing here is if we have a look at my material, it is just using like a standard Unity particle material, and I know these have changed now in later versions of Unity, but you can still get the same thing. So yeah, that's fine. This is my texture sheet. There's no point in me sharing this because I mean I just threw it together in Photoshop in like 2 minutes, and it's not even the best. So it's just kind of an example. But what I'm doing with that, at least what I think I'm doing with that, is I've set it here to spawn on a start frame, of 1. Well, maybe I could do 0 actually. Yeah, so 0 to 8 it's supposed to be, but it won't go all the way up to 8. Because I have 8 images, and for the frame over time I have it in a flat line. I don't think it matters where this line is, but it's just by default at the top, because normally I think by default you'll have this, so it will start at frame 0 and it will go up to frame 8, and then it will pick any random frame. So let's say it starts at frame 3 here, then it will start here and then go up and up and up. I don't want that, because if you can see what's on my screen now, these just are jittering around like crazy. Whereas what I wanted to happen is I wanted it to choose a random image from my texture sheet and to spawn that. And I can't tell if that's actually happening. I think it is happening. I don't think it is actually spawning the exact same one every time. But the fact that I can't really tell is good enough for me. And that is kind of it for the static stuff. So I'll stop that, and we'll come to the Wibbels. So I'm using the exact same material here. These are the from the texture sheet animation stuff. That's why this one's called Wibbels. And what this does, very similar to the static one. The only difference is I have a force over lifetime, where I'm just making it go down, or at least what is down relative to the camera. So it's across here, but it's down here. So yeah, I have lessened the emission amount here by quite a bit. So this is at most spawning about 90, which is fine. But for the most part it is kind of the same, except for just a teeny tiny bit of noise, and you've really got to be careful with the noise. I did enable the separate axes here, and on the axis that I actually wanted it to move, which was the X, so for me that would be across, like left and right as we see it now. It's just a teeny tiny little bit, and then the frequency I just increased a bit. But for you, and this is why it's kind of hard to do this as a step-by-step, because if you're even working at a slightly different scale to me, and honestly, because it's just a camera looking at some particles out in space, the scale can be whatever you want. Like, there's no way for me to know what you would end up using. So, you absolutely don't need to use the exact same values as I'm using, so long as the result ends up kind of the same. Like, you might actually have to use quite a high value here. It's up to you. You can, if you want, also kind of mess with some of these other axes, but I just wanted them to kind of fall down and shift a bit to the left, shift a bit to the right. And then as they kind of come down, it is actually going through that texture sheet animator. And this is where I actually have it moving up a frame. So as you can see, as they come down, they are actually changing. And on its own, that really doesn't look that great. In fact, if we come over to the cube, and then let's see Wibbels, and let's get like a nice kind of angle of this. You know, if you look closely, you can tell it is just kind of, you know, it's kind of switching its state. But when you put the whole thing together, it works pretty nicely, in my opinion, at least. But yeah, anyway, so let's hit the F key again, and so we're back here. So that's the Wibbels. That's kind of how I have it set up. Again, you know, it's the same as the static. I just use less of them. The texture sheet actually animates, and I just control their velocity a touch. So, you know, some are coming down at minus 0.1 and some are coming down at minus 0.3. Again, you don't have to use these exact same numbers. It depends entirely on your scale. So then lastly, the trail. And there's a fair few of these, but basically what's happening here is I have a particle that you can't see that is basically controlling where all of these trails go. So let's actually, for now, I'll turn the trails off, and let's make this, just because we can, a bright pink, and I'll full alpha that. So this is what my particle system actually looks like here. And essentially, it's pretty much the same as the Wibbels, which was the same as the static. The only difference here is they have a bit more noise in that they are kind of moving a lot more sort of to the left and to the right, and they're also falling down a lot quicker. Some will only come slow, but others are for sure moving down a lot faster. And that's kind of it. You know, again, I'm trying to use like a smaller amount here because it is also going to generate some trails, but I have them lasting over a much longer lifetime. I think these trails last the longest out of all of these, because the static, I believe, only lasts about 6 seconds, which is ×2 speed. So they will actually, like, as soon as one spawns, it will actually only live for about 3 seconds. Stop that. So my trail, I do have again the 2 times speed, but its lifetime is twice that of the static. So even though I am spawning less, because I'm allowing them to live for longer, that sounds weird, it means that it does generate more. But anyway, you know, this is just the basics of particles. So yeah, size of a lifetime, I do have this, so it's not really important. I tried to do it so it just increases almost immediately, as in, so as soon as it spawns, it kind of just whoop, you know, straight up. But I'm pretty sure if I were to just disable that, there would be no change. In fact, let me just re-enable my trail. Yeah, I mean, it's the same. So yeah, I'll keep the trails on for now. There's nothing fancy happening here on the renderer side of things. It's just a default particle. And yeah, basically all I'm doing is for the actual particles that are driving these trails, I just have 0 alpha, which I know it's not very efficient, you know, because it is actually still kind of, if I just go into wireframe, wow, that's nuts. Probably, actually, it's a good job I did that. I don't need my vertex distance to be so much, maybe 0.1. Okay, so that's a bit simpler. So if I were to pause this somewhere, at the start of these trails, there is going to be, you know, a quad that is there. But if we go into shaded, there isn't actually anything there because we have the alpha at 0. So yeah, you know, not the best. But again, this is something that it won't render on your screen. It just exists somewhere in the world that is rendering. It's still, you know, not ideal, but for the easiness of making this effect, it's you know, it's pretty cool. So yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it. That's, you know, the trail, the Wibbels, and the static. When you throw them all together, you get something like this. But again, I mean, you can tweak any of the things that I've shown you. They're all pretty simple. You are, after all, the master of your shiny wet ball. I don't think Chef Jean would like that. But yeah, so now let's just move on to the shader. And for this, might as well actually come back to a more presentation-y view, because This will kind of be, you know, something nice to look at. So I'll just hit play there. Cool, and let's go ahead and look at our shader. Okay, so I guess I'll run through the basics first. I mean, this is just the albedo that I multiply with a tint, so this is what allows me to change the color. I don't know why I put the default as that color. It can be, you know, whatever. And so this allows us to change the color of the actual texture itself. You know, it's a multiply effect. Yeah, that's what that's for. So pretty simple, just tint, multiply, albedo, straight into the albedo. And then here, again, nothing kind of too fancy. This is just a texture sample for my normal map, this one, the one that I'm not actually using, but it's there. And then I've also just, in the scale input, just added the normal strength property. If you are using shader graph, I believe you have your own normal strength node. So if you just search for that, then you'll be able to find that. But anyway, this normal map is being blended through a normal create, because we have here a texture object, which is the actual the place here where we put in our render texture. But from that, I needed to get a normal map out of it, and so that's what this normal create node does. Oh, and actually, to be fair, I'm not entirely sure shader graph has that. I should have checked, because I already said at the start of the video that you could totally do it, but I'm pretty sure you can do it. Either way, you just wouldn't have normals, which not the worst thing in the world. But yeah, anyway, so the reason that this is a texture object is because the normal create node needs a texture input. So if I were to have just used a texture sample and put the render texture in here, I wouldn't be able to feed that into the normal create, because it just, you know, it does not accept that input. So that's why I have this texture object here, which also controls the render texture down here. Although, I mean, when I say controls, that's the wrong word. Basically, let's do this again. So if I have a texture object, and so this would be the property that you would put a texture into on a material. Although normally you're probably more used to the texture sample. But the nice thing about this texture object is you can have many texture samples, and if I were to feed this into all of these, and then let's just call this the texture. I think I might need to hook this up to some stuff, otherwise it doesn't actually work. I mean, let's just hit that button, actually, see if it pops up. No, okay, so it does actually need to be hooked in. Okay, that's a bit annoying. I should point out now, you don't need to do this. I'm just trying to explain things horribly, so I'm just going to throw this into emission just for the hell of it. And okay, that's great. But basically, I have a property here called the texture, which is for this one. So it's not any of these, because these will take on whatever this one is. You probably worked that out ages ago, and I didn't have to go through that. So I apologize for that. Although apparently I say sorry too much. So, you know what? I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. But yeah, the reason that I have this texture object going into this texture sample here is so that I can actually control the tiling of the rain itself. And then I also, if you see here, I use this for my specularity. Now you might have noticed that I have a property here called float1. This isn't actually a property that I've exposed. I could expose it, but basically if I were to put this at 1, so 1, basically it's kind of like if this property didn't even exist, and I just put that down there. For me, although it actually kind of looks alright now, which is weird, but the reason I had this up to like 3 was I wasn't getting the wetness that I wanted, you know, because I think the white values of this texture just weren't strong enough, and so that was why I just kind of came in here and multiplied it by 3, just so that they would pop out a little bit more. Hopefully you can see there. So now it is, you know, it's a lot more shinier. So that's all that was for. If your particle system is, you know, super white, then you don't have to, you know, do this spec boost. And the last thing is just the smoothness for the base mesh itself, or rather the base material. So this has nothing to do with the rain. It's just for the actual underlying texture. And so again, you could just, instead of a slider here, although I do recommend still having one, you can just use a texture sample, and it would be, you know, your actual sort of metallic map or whatever that had the smoothness in the alpha. Yeah, lastly, only because my object isn't metal, although it's not metal right now, it could be, but I just have a float value that just feeds straight into metallic. Again, not a property because I wasn't fussed about using anything metal, but you know, up to you. Again, that you could use a texture, or, you know, actually expose this property. But yeah, that is about it. I mean, I thought that would be kind of quick, but I swear it's been like half an hour or something. Imagine how long it would have taken if I'd built this from scratch. Aye. Yeah, so that is that. I will just kind of increase the size of this window if it will let me, so that, you know, if you wanted to kind of just take a screenshot of that, you're more than welcome. But yeah, that's kind of it. There's nothing special happening over here. In fact, I think a lot of these is just pretty default. And I had my hand over my mouth while I was talking then, as if I was trying to think like some philosopher. So if the audio got a bit mumbled, that's probably why. Okay, so yeah, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. I would imagine, you know, like the particle stuff is probably where a lot of people are gonna have the most kind of inquiries. But again, you know, so long as you kind of get the behavior that you want, then, you know, it's all good. Like if I were to remake this particle system from scratch right now, it wouldn't turn out exactly the same as this, but I'd still aim for the same kind of things. You know, you'd have the static stuff, you'd have your wibbly things coming down, and then you'd have your trails, and, you know, you can throw some other stuff in there. You could kind of go all crazy. You could come into the shader and have some sort of panning normal map that also kind of went down with it, as if like the entire surface was like super wet. The world is your oyster on that one. Yeah, so that is it for me today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has proved somewhat useful, and I will see you in the next one.